So we might start first of all with Ronnie. Can you tell us what were the main challenges responding to COVID-19 at first and then later as social distancing measures changed? How did that happen?
So, Kathy, good question, really. The first thing to say is the Jewish community is very community-minded. Nothing is celebrated or commemorated on its own as an individual. Almost everything is done within a community. So, for example, Jewish festivals, we've just passed 2 festivals. The first one in lockdown, in fact, was the festival of Pesach or Passover, traditionally associated with families getting together. I suppose it's a bit like the Jewish Christmas, I guess. People will travel from around the globe. You know, sons and daughters will travel around the globe to go back home for Pesach or Passover. We also had Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, just a couple of weeks ago. So the first thing to say is that in isolation, it's been a struggle for members of the Jewish community because they're used to doing things together. And every life cycle is the same. Whether it be a birth and a circumcision or a girl's baby naming at the start, the bar and bat mitzvah, weddings, all of those are celebrated big style. And so so I can tell you now that it hit the community hard. It was out of our comfort zone. And it meant that we had to change the way we operate, as no doubt everyone has, whether you're faith-based or not. In terms of our faith, a lot of the things we do are done as a group. So aside from the calendar cycle or aside from the family life cycle, we have things that we do as a group. We learn together, we pray together. In fact, the concept of a minyan, which is basically at least 10 males getting together, and we can come back to gender issues maybe later on, but 10 males getting together, that was the mainstay for many of our people within our religion. And so to be told that synagogues have closed meant that they've had to change, we've had to change, and our congregants have had to change the way we operate. And I think part of the problem was not only us delivering our services differently, but also getting the members of our religion to realise that the way they've operated, it can be done differently. They just didn't realise because this is the way they've been brought up. They just assumed that you had to pray together, but you don't. They assumed that you had to have people all together to do a circumcision. Well, in fact, you don't. The way we commemorate the death anniversary, what we call a yahrzeit, every year there's one commemorates the anniversary of a loved person's passing. That was traditionally done. You came to the synagogue and you did something public and so on, but there was nothing that required you to do so. You could light a candle at home and study texts and so on. So it's really the struggle was not just on our behalf, but the struggle was also on behalf of our religion. People were just not used to changing the way they operate. And if there's time, I'm happy to speak about the way we've had to structure our fees and our finances.
So perhaps if I could just quickly ask, how did the quick response happen? Where were those decisions, both religious decisions, but also government decisions about closing synagogues and finding alternatives? How quickly did they come in force and who was making the decision?
In the case of our synagogue, in fact, many of the synagogues closed early before government mandated that the churches and synagogues had to close. We actually closed, it was a board decision on the night of the 18th of March. We had our regular board meeting, and at that board meeting, we decided to close effective immediately. So services for the morning of the 19th didn't happen. That, as I said, that predated the government-mandated closure. The decision was made based on several factors. Firstly, we saw the writing on the wall. We saw that things were getting out of hand. In our congregation particularly, we've got a lot of older members, and we know that they were people at risk, significant risk. So the decision was made in a corporate way by the board. It was put to the board predominantly by the president of the board, discussed the issues, and then communicated fairly rapidly the following morning to our community. And then from there on, we actually got guidance not only from government advisories, but the Jewish community had two organisations that played a role. One was a Jewish task force on COVID. It actually, if you like, supplanted what I'd set up 20 years ago, GEMP, Jewish Emergency Management Plan. They then became the Jewish Community Crisis Management, and they set up a task force and were providing almost daily updates. The second group was the Melbourne Beth Din. It's the rabbinical court. And they issued advisories on not attending services. And then once things started relaxing about the protocols they believe were appropriate, most of those, by the way, exceeding government regulations, for reopening services. So, for example, just one quick example, people get called up to the Torah. The Torah is the scroll that we read, that's read a few times a week. People get called to the Torah. They've said as soon as we reopen, people are no longer to kiss the Torah, which we would normally do as a sign of respect or a sign of love, and issues are related to social distancing between the person reading the Torah and the person called up. So they put out guidelines. So together with those two agencies, we were getting great feedback, and we were providing constant feedback to our board and to our members every week. We were providing more and more. In fact, we changed the delivery of our services and increased our services during this period.
Interesting. I'm wondering if Sheik Saleem, if you're listening, if you would like to join into this discussion, how were Muslim communities reacting immediately, and then as time passed? Tilly, can we find Sheik Saleem if he's prepared to?
Yeah, we've unmuted here.
Response, unmuted.
Okay.
Saleem from the Board of Imams, and also from a friend of the Sir Zelman Cowen Centre.
Thank you very much. And as you would appreciate, that Muslim community responded very well in adhering to the government-imposed restrictions. And the Board of Imam was upfront when this COVID-19 restrictions came about, and we have advised them not to hold Jummah prayers because the risk was very high compared to other religious organizations, because we are not only just standing and praying, we also making prostration, and we have to take wudu or ablution outside, and we have towels and so on. So, and then for the Jummah prayer, the crowd is pretty large and we can't control. So and then we cannot stop, okay, you are 60 years or more, so you don't come, because they are the people who would like to come more than anyone else. So there was a lot of logistics considerations. So we said, okay, we have a civic duty to contain this spreading of the violence. And then everyone, all those people, all those imams that we thought they would know how to use the technology, and they started using Zoom. And they started spreading, their messages soon. And you know that it's also the Ramadan was during this tough time. So the people have been asked to stay home and conduct their community prayer at night prayers with the family. And many families expressed their appreciation after a long time. They were able to do the congregational prayer with the family. And then they also followed the daily briefings, so daily reading of Quran through Zoom. And Board of Imam, from its part, we have a Jummah sermon through Channel 31 every Friday during the Ramadan, and it is going on for the next couple of weeks. So that was watched by many people, especially people in prisons, and they did feel also some kind of a lockdown while they were there, and then nothing happening because the visitors are not going anymore and the families, imams are not accessible to them. So as a result, they were able to feel a little bit of belonging to the community by watching Channel 31 program. And then pretty much people are still continuing giving their sermons through through Zoom. And as you know that the people were readily accepted this this whole setup, or at least the new way of conducting religious observances, is because it is not only happening here, it is happening from the Ka'batullah, the very place that we are facing the mosque, the grand mosque in Mecca and in Medina, and in many other places. The jurists have been very upfront to come up with the fatwa, like you have these rabbinical advices, we have the fatwa, and they all came and said, okay, you can do your own prayers, congregational prayers.
Thank you, Sheikh Saleem. I didn't want to interrupt you, but we might just keep moving along, and I'll bring you back into the conversation if you don't mind at various points. Yeah. But that's fascinating, and I think one of the things that's emerged both from what Rabbi Figdor has said and what Sheikh Saleem has said is how quick faith-based communities who are known to be quite traditional were suddenly able to change course and adapt, which I guess is why they've been around for so long. If I can actually then bring in Reverend Ian Smith, I do want you to comment about what some of the Christian communities that you've been dealing with, how they responded. But I have a very special question for you. What's the right balance, because a lot of this deals with governance issues, between governance and service delivery and faith-based community values when you're under crisis?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land as we recognise elders past, present, and those emerging. And I want to commit to the process of reconciliation, both within our own state and nation, and obviously in this current moment within the global world of Lives Matter. So in the context of that crisis, one of the things I've been reflecting on as a CEO is that don't panic is a little motto. And so I probably fielded 60 or 70 phone calls from faith leaders, particularly across the church, particularly in the smaller communities, for whom this moment has been a real moment of changing the game plan. And so my first reaction in terms of the balancing between governance and service is not to panic, to take a step back, to take a breath, and to try and reflect objectively rather than from the gut reaction. I think, as Ronnie and Sheik said, initially it was really complex and really weird, you know, fancy not gathering. You know, and as Ronnie suggests, you know, when Pesha is happening, it's our Holy Week and it's the most holy moment of the church. And we do everything similar to our Jewish brothers and sisters in the sense that, you know, it's around gathering. A group of us had spent 8 months planning the Palm Sunday march through the city. 15,000 people, we were walking for refugees and the acknowledgement that we ought to be good people and good neighbours and welcome others into our worlds. Suddenly all that goes out the window and it's easy to panic. But I think one of the lessons is that we need to stop and be really objective, and good governance helps you walk through that objectivity. I wrote down 3 things that I think has been really helpful in the journey. One is to remind ourselves of the basis of our existence. Who are we? What are we? What is the critical thing that causes us to live and breathe? So in our faith context, it's about affirming the narrative. It's about living out of the story of where we find meaning and purpose. The second one is to review our activities. to look through our activities and say, what are the essential parts of what we've done that we need to continue, but be really hard and ask the question, what are the non-objective, non-essential parts that we can comfortably let go of that are really convenient when there are no restrictions, but now are superfluous to how we might operate. So we need that review of all our activities. What's essential, what's non-essential. The third one, and one that I've been really conscious of, is we need to be really aware of how our staff are travelling. I, for one, am a person who is a social animal. The longer this goes on, the more I feel like I'm climbing up a wall, and I keep working out ways of adapting the restrictions. And so I discovered that if you meet a friend for a cup of coffee and you go for a walk around the block, you can exercise, you can have a takeaway coffee, and you can have a meeting, and you can have a socialisation, providing you've got distance. We've got to be really careful that in a moment like this, people don't get lost. So the critical thing about our faith communities is that we are people working with people for the betterment of other people. And we need to be really conscious of staff. So how do staff travel? Are staff better in a quiet space? Are they more social? Do they, and if we've changed from essential activities to non-essential or the other way around, have we left somebody out? Have we suddenly left a person with nothing to do and all those? So we need that real strong sense of how our staff are travelling. The fourth one I'd say is you've got to get really switched on to what the government and what our health sectors are saying. So one of the things that my role has contacting with Brett's, contacting with people like Vivian Nugent, the head of VMC, talking to somebody from DPC, Department of Premier and Cabinet, and building those liaisons so that you're across the latest information. And then when the information is distributed from one of those sources, being in the conduit place where you can disseminate that to your people really quickly. Because the worst thing in a crisis is lack of information, which then leads to rumour, and then rumour leads to fear. And, you know, we've got to try and cut the nexus of that. So really good links around that.
Ian,
my last point, I think, is around flexibility. In a crisis, you've got to be super flexible. So the balancing act is holding together objectivity, intention, and being flexible.
Thank you. That's very important for all organisations as principles of good governance. I think the communication is interesting because I think faith-based communities are actually very good communicators. They have ways of contacting, you know, their congregations and mobilising them very quickly. So maybe they were at an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Nadav, can I bring you in here because we've talked about the values base, we've talked about, you know, what's essential, what's not essential, but for some communities and organisations, this was an existential crisis, right? They really need funds and, you know, they have buildings. So in many ways, if we move outside of the faith sphere and look at them as an organisation, what are the three key legal issues for faith-based organisations to responding to, but also recovering from COVID-19?
Let me just make sure that my microphone is working.
Yep, you're great.
We can hear you.
Well, let me just say this. The starting point is that communities, or for example, in the Jewish sense, what we call a kahila, have both a religious personality and a social personality, but also a legal existence. When we talk about legal personality, that's the kind of legal entity that you are. And that creates different natures of obligations that you have to comply with. You might have a company, you might have an incorporated association, you might have an unincorporated association. Everything from the church with its structures all the way through to the great synagogue in Sydney have different kinds of legal regulations and structures that apply. So the starting point is know thyself. If you don't know what you are, it's very difficult to understand what your obligations are, because at the end of the day, if you are an incorporated association, you have an annual meeting that's coming up. And even with everything else going on, you still need to make a return and a statement if you're large enough, and conduct an audit and all kinds of other things. So if you're a company, you have a board of directors that may need to meet. If you are an unincorporated group, you have a different set of problems that have to be met. So the existential crisis is met very differently depending on who you are and what you are as a collective. There are also things that aren't necessarily religious. For example, paying the rent. And if you have a rent over a commercial tenancy, or what we call a retail tenancy, the government has put in place a new set of regulations, the Omnibus Bill, as it's so wonderfully called, that contains special rules about how you can ask your landlord for a reduction. On the other hand, and some facts, groups have property that they rent out as well. So just because you're a religious organisation doesn't mean that you're not required to comply with, for example, rent reduction requests that require you to do things efficiently. So the biggest one that has come up for me in the last 2 weeks has been people saying, look, we have to have our AGM. How do we have an AGM? How do we have a gathering when we're not supposed to gather? And there are rules about technology and technology provisions for having virtual meetings. It might be hard to have virtual prayer, but in most cases, it's relatively easy to have your AGM by Zoom. And for many organisations, this will probably become the new normal. So it's a really important thing to look at the rules. What is governing your specific organisation and structure? The other thing is that just because the world is ending doesn't mean that you don't have to file your tax returns and deal with your compliance obligations. The government has made some financial adjustments that I'm sure Adam will talk about, but it hasn't made the compliance framework disappear, even if there are sometimes an extension. The other thing to remember is that obligations, and those organisations in particular, you're in the spotlight about things like mandatory reporting. Mandatory reporting doesn't change just because things are happening by Zoom rather than happening in person. And statistically, more abuse happens online, including more sexual abuse and more grooming than happens in person. There are arguments about it, but there are some suggestions it's by a factor of 100. So the same practices, concerns, everything that you were doing before is still likely to be around. I'll flag one last thing, and that is for you all to be aware of and to consider, and that is that no one has yet tested the liability that organisations may have for infection. So we are yet to have court cases where an organisation, say a synagogue, might be held responsible for injury or death resulting from allowing a person to come into their building who has an infectious disease. It hasn't happened yet, but it's very likely that it will happen. So please make sure that you're maintaining your insurance cover, including your old insurance with runoff, because those are the kinds of things that are likely to be excluded. So know thyself, make sure that you're keeping up with your existing compliance framework, and keep looking out. I'll just mention one other thing. We are now, the government's current edition of the directives, and they have a wonderful title called the Stay-at-Home Directions, for example. We're now up to our 7th edition. We also have something like 15 editions of the other sets of regulations that are being promulgated and changed all the time. You have to keep up to date with them. They, for example, govern how many people are allowed to gather for the purposes of conducting a religious ceremony, capacity requirements, and there is no safe harbour for saying, look at the old regulations. If things change, and they can go up and down, you must be aware of them. Ignorance has never been an excuse under the law.
Thanks, Nadav. And while we're talking about existential crises and rent, landlords and tenants, also employees, we might turn to Adam and ask Adam to give us an update on some of the financial implications of COVID-19 for faith-based communities.
No worries. Thank you, Kathy. And thanks to all that are sort of attending today. Hopefully we can provide you with some value to take back to each of your organisations. So basically, I just wanted to have a bit of a chat about the financial viability and what we've been seeing in practice happen out there, and maybe just put a bit of a framework around it, and split that framework into sort of two sections of things that we can sort of immediately do around cash flow, which is obviously very important for any organisation to keep up and running. So the first part of it will be short-term cash flow, and the second part of it will be sort of the short to medium-term cash flow, what we can do there. Now, Ian made some good points earlier with regards to the focus of an organisation. We've seen a lot of people become as lean as they possibly could up front. And what does that mean? That basically means they look to cut their discretionary spending as much as possible and concentrate on their core purpose or their core service. Which is the first thing you can do to just really bring the business back to its bare bones. In saying that, though, you always want to be mindful of not sacrificing the organisational infrastructure that you may have built over a long time, because we're sort of starting to see it now in that the economy is starting to rebound, and there's a lot more good feelings out there. So it will turn, and when it does, it will turn hard. Well, that's what I believe to be true anyway. And so we need to be prepared for that. So we don't want to sacrifice, throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And so that's sort of what you can do straight away. As far as the next sort of point I want to make with the short-term cash flow is to try and secure as much stimulus or grant money as you can, whether that's through the much publicised JobKeeper payments, the cash flow boost for PAYG withholding on employees seeking rent relief, which Nadav touched on, and even just from a state government level, trying to get land tax reliefs and utility reliefs. There is a lot of reliefs out there, and you only have to ask the question, and generally you can get some access to that. Now, I did just want to touch on... Can I
just ask, is it too late for JobKeeper?
No, yeah, so that was the next point. I was just going to take a bit of a minute to talk about JobKeeper. That's fine. So basically the JobKeeper scheme runs through until the 27th of September, so basically the end of September. So if you haven't opted in, that doesn't mean you can't opt in. We've got now still 3 to 4 months to still take part in the scheme. And so how do we enter the scheme? We basically, as a charity or a religious institution, you need to be registered with the ACNC. And if you have experienced a drop in your turnover comparative to the same month or the same quarter last year, so if we were you, as an example, we would drop made by 50. From whatever JobKeeper fortnight we are in up until the end of September. So basically, if you think you've had a drop in your turnover comparative to the same month last year, and there are a number of specialised rules relating to charities and religious institutions, which I won't go into at the moment because they're a bit complex and we don't have time. But we've got the next JobKeeper fortnight finishes on the 21st of this month. So basically 10 days, jump in, and you can get back paid for the fortnight in relation to not only your employees, but your religious practitioners or religious institutions, which they brought in as the original legislation effectively excluded them. So that was a good thing by the government, we think. And then if you do qualify for JobKeeper, it's mandated that you in turn qualify for rent relief in conjunction with the decline in turnover that you've had for JobKeeper. So you can get a rent relief of at a minimum 30% or 15%, because that's your drop in turnover that it takes to qualify to get into the scheme in the first place. So that's what we can do in the short term. And if we move to the second part of the framework, the sort of the short to medium term cash flow, it's basically where we start to get a bit more sophisticated and we look at things like cash flow forecasts. What a cash flow forecast does is allows an organisation to understand their cost structure and any impending deficits that might be coming up. And what it does do is give you the confidence to take on the future by taking some of the mystery out of the future as much as possible. You're never going to get it 100% right. It's a bit of a guessing game at times. But knowing that you have costs coming up versus knowing that you have 10K of costs coming up is a very powerful difference in terms of making decisions moving forward. And basically the knock-on effect from completing a cash flow forecast is understanding then that you may have deficits coming up, and you can approach the banks to secure some finance in relation to helping you get through that period. They do, from the pandemic, the banks do offer unsecured loans that are 50% government backed, but they are also financing business normally to help with cash flow. And it's all to basically secure any finance. The banks are always going to want to see a cash flow forecast, and they're going to want to know that generally you've been profitable over the past 1 to 2 years. At some point in time, because at the end of the day, they're a business themselves, and they need to know that if they lend money, it's going to be paid back. They've got responsible lending
one of the things
criteria.
One of the things I'm registering is how important it is to have our governance structure with an audit risk committee and having good financial practices, because you never know when you're going to have to suddenly, show those records. Who would have predicted? Sometimes I know with small organisations, faith-based communities, you kind of leave it to the last minute. That would not have been a good strategy here as a takeaway governance lesson.
Can I just pipe in? One of the critical steps that particularly churches and synagogues have to deal with is if there are restrictions under their trust deed from borrowing. So many organisations have a structure where the land or the building that the church is on will be owned by trustees rather than by the church itself. And that separation was very common from the 1800s until quite recently as an asset protection tool. And very often, only the trustees, if anyone, will be allowed to give a mortgage, will be allowed to give property as security. So when it comes to providing assets and figuring out what your assets are, it's really important that you understand your structure and the division, because otherwise when you're doing your cash flow forecast and your balance sheet and everything else, and certainly if you're knocking on doors asking to borrow and have some security, it may not be yours to begin with, and it may not be something that you can use in that fashion. So checking early is really, really important, because if you go back to the bank and say, well, I wanted $500,000 and I was giving you, I'll say, St. Paul's Cathedral as security, that's one thing. If it's the personal pledge of someone who's taken a vow of poverty, it can be a little bit different. So it's much better to check before you have the somewhat embarrassing conversation.
Ian, you were coming in there because I know that churches are often under a very complex arrangement of ownership of land.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I just affirm everything that Nadav said, that yes, most churches would be unable to use their facilities or land as a asset to draw against because of trust relations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a critical thing for anybody. You know, any of us, it's critical to make sure that we're allowed to draw against something.
Yes. Ian, while I've got you there on screen, can we move away a bit from the sort of technical elements of what people are doing and how they need to go about it, and talk more in the sort of impact, the pastoral impact of COVID-19. Have you been aware of the gender dimensions that this pandemic has presented for communities? And then I'll ask the other people the same question. This is my, you know,
what I'm hearing, if I change hats a little bit from the VCC to my other role, which is Faith Communities Council Victoria.
Ian, you don't wear a hat?
No. Very good, Ronnie. One of the things we've been discussing at the Faith Communities Council is that there is an anecdotal perception that in this crisis, women are far more vulnerable and children are far more vulnerable, because often what's happening in lockdown is that there is a insinuation, there's a extension or a inflaming of any tension in family. And so many of the faith communities across Victoria are experiencing and working really hard to try and alleviate the disadvantage that women and children are finding in a context where, because one partner doesn't leave the house, there isn't the breaker to some of the conversation. So I think one of the costs going forward is going to be that pastorally, however we all understand pastoral care or caring for our communities, there is going to be a real need to revisit some of the relationships that our communities have where there has been real tension applied because of the unusual nature of working from home. I'm aware that in some homes, the new office is a kitchen table. Well, you know, if you've got a laptop and a printer and stuff set up on the kitchen table and it's a place where the family eat and work, there's a whole blurring of the lines about what is and what isn't and who should and who can't, creates phenomenal tension. I think going forward, one of the hidden costs for all faith communities is going to be how we bring our communities out of this in a way where there are really healthy relationships, both within the family units, but also within the congregational units. I've had a number of conversations recently with clergy about, as we've gone from 10 people to 20 people, and the projection is that maybe 50 by the beginning of July, a number of clergy are finding that their congregants are really scared to come back. You know, there's a real anxiousness about what happens, what's it mean? Pastorally, I think, whether it's Ronnie or it's me or it's a Sheik or it's anybody else in this conversation, well, I think we're going to be we need to be really mindful that we're going to have to work really hard at rebuilding some of the foundational building blocks of community, where we find trust, how we move back into relationships. Though there are going to be some, it's a bit like a bell curve. The first 10% will be racing in the door. There'll be a few that will never come back. And then there's that 80% on the lip of the curve who will find it increasingly awkward to come, and we'll have to just manage that in a whole new way.
Mm. Thank you.
Ian, can I just pipe in and say that right now there is a different opportunity for renewal because of the technology generation, which is perhaps my generation or a little bit younger, who are now all of a sudden being provided with and have a more valuable skill for the new way that many communities are going to be structured. And there is an enormous opportunity for meaningful participation by young people that may have been marginalised structurally before, because now their skills are given new prominence. So for most organisations, the possibility of having a shadow board or in fact engaging in aggressive continuity plans by targeting the under 60s and probably the under 25s is really important. Usually organisational knowledge transfer is the biggest structural weakness for faith-based communities, because you have the same people doing everything. But now all of a sudden we have a huge push to engage people in a technological way. And I'd say most people over the age of 65 would ask their grandchildren how to set up a mobile phone. The same is true for asking your grandchildren for how to more effectively engage in technological communities rather than simply locational communities. And so I'd like to hope that everyone gets at least one 25 or under year old onto their board by the end of the crisis, if not 5.
Nadav, thank you.
Yeah,
in fact, that brings me to a kind of final-ish question of the panellists, and I'm hoping that Sheikh Saleem can also come in here. What will be the legacy of this? What will be the good bits? And Nadav's raised one element of that, generational change and renewal for faith-based communities. Are there any other legacies of what we've just been going through? Maybe, Ronnie?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps I'll address 3 different aspects. The first one is work from home. Can I say that I'm the only one in the office at the moment? The rest of the staff are working from home, but we've discovered that we've actually found some efficiencies we never dreamt of, and we were sort of forced into it because we realised there was still some stuff that we were operating off paper, and now because staff have to share things between them, we worked out a way that we could do some of that stuff and realise, oh, that's a much more efficient way. So one of the positive things is because of necessity, we've redeveloped some systems which we never thought of and realised they're better ways. The second thing is new ways to deliver services. Both we and our congregants have sort of assumed a particular way of service delivery that's evolved over, in our case, millennia. But of course, now with technology and picking up on something that I've said, we've certainly developed new ways to engage with people, and some of our younger congregants are suddenly getting engaged because we're now speaking Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. Some of the technologies which we didn't think were necessary, we've actually engaged a social media expert over the last few months. And it's reaped benefits because we're now reaching out in ways we never realised we could, and it's speaking to a different demographic. And the third thing, I suppose, in terms of, but I'm happy to answer questions, the third things I suppose to mention in terms of positive developments is in fact some personal professional development. I've now learned some new things that, although I come from an IT background, I never really focused a lot on delivery of my services or delivery of meetings via technology until I was forced to invest in that. And of course, now I've learned something. So certainly some positives have come out through necessity.
So, Sheikh Saleem or someone I see from the Board of Imams, is there something you would like to add about what has come through as a legacy, good or bad, from the current pandemic for communities?
I'm very sure that benefiting from the overseas scholars has become easy. Now we don't need to apply for visa anymore, so we can bring them Zoom, and people are really comfortable listening to them distantly. And that has become a legacy, I think, for sure, in the next Ramadan, hopefully. And definitely there is a women's participation probably has become, I'm not very sure whether it is increased or decreased. And because we cannot we can see in the mosque whenever we have congregations, we can see the large crowd of female participants. But during the Zoom times, we are not very sure whether they are a participant or not in this place. It's only the male participant or not. So that may be a bad legacy, I'm sure, because we can't. And we also do not know whether the younger people really participated in the family environment and so on. So these are the off-the-cuff observations from that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Sheik. If I could just, I think we've got quite a number of very good questions coming in on the chat line, and I wanted to give people an opportunity while we have this expert group with us. Greta, do you want to curate those questions to see what the thrust is of a lot of them?
Yeah, so we've got about 12 questions, so I'll try and group some of them together. The first one, a couple of them touch on some of the technical financial stuff, so we might start with that. So we have a question about DGR status, and this is in regards to seeking grants. Small faith groups without DGR status seem to not be eligible for a lot of community or business grants, and so the question is, are there any workarounds if you're in these circumstances?
So Adam, Nadav.
I'm happy to take that one.
Yep.
Sure. The answer is yes and no, as with most things. Grant giving is usually defined by the parameters of the person that's giving the grant. And many organizations and government entities are moving towards a more accountability in the way they give out money, but at the same time wanting to spend less money on managing that accountability. That means using pre-existing government provers, like being registered with the ACNC or having DGR status. The presumption in most of those cases is that doing so ensures a level of compliance. And that is the trend. And that's why, whilst a lawyer might be important, I've got to say, having a really good accountant who can maintain your demonstrable compliance is probably the most important thing after your selection of a pastor or religious leader, because today the flow of money is only going to be as wide as your ability to demonstrate a clean, appropriate, sensible balance sheet. The other issue with DGR is that many of the organisations that are giving money can only do it pursuant to their tax rules to DGR organisations. In those cases, you can't get any money through those foundations. Sometimes you can go to whoever gave the money to the foundation and say, look, we were a small group, we're not yet there at DGR, but that's outside the existing grant schemes. My advice, being most practical, is that if your organisation is serving more than 100 people a week, and whether that's through prayer or through charity or otherwise, you should already be looking to get to DGR status. If you have 1,000 contacts a month, you should already be looking to go down the ACNC full-on registration route. Get your compliance in order early. You'll have to do it eventually if you're going to grow and be successful. Better to do it early. Better to invest money in a program like Xero, an accounting software platform that is going to help you and all of your people get your books in order early. It makes a big difference to how you'll be viewed for a very long time. But I've got to say, Adam is more important than I am on these things, because I can tell you what to do, but if you don't actually have someone who is keeping you on the rails, then a donor who asks to look in your books will say, well, there's the old story that the books of the organisation are a pile of pieces of paper that have built up over the years, and you can tell what the board had for lunch on the third Tuesday of 1972 because they all have their crumbs on that pad, that's all the way down. That doesn't cut it anymore, particularly now where we're in a Darwinian era where organisations are going to fall over. So you might be able to get a few dollars working around, but it's a very temporary solution.
I've got another question that actually is quite relevant to that. So another question
Yes,
is...
and maybe we'll get Ian to help answer it because
yeah,
it's,
Ian or,
yep.
or Adam. So it's can we elaborate so how every institution has handled member fees adjustment? So as we know, institutions still have ongoing costs even if people are not physically there. So the question, I suppose, is can you adjust your member fees to deal with
Ian
this?
first, Ronnie, and then Adam, if you've got any comments on that, but maybe Ian starting and then Ronnie.
What was the very first part of the question? I missed it. So maybe Ronnie can answer it and I'll come back.
Okay, Ronnie, come on in.
So it's an excellent question. I don't know who asked it, but of course, in our case, people are expecting, it's a bit like gym membership. You expect to be there, and even though we're delivering service via Zoom, you're not there. So what am I paying for? So first thing to say is our annual fees, by the way, those are normally invoiced at the start of April, right when we went to lockdown. They were invoiced, by the way. But our cover letter explained that normally we normally ask people to pay by the end of May. We firstly extended it to the end of June. We invited people to make contact with us if they had any issues about paying. We've, for a long time, encouraged people to consider paying in periodic payments. And so anyone who had some concerns did contact us. I have to say they weren't that many. We put a moratorium on fee-based resignations. That means that anyone who's contacted us saying, look, I want to resign, I can't afford it, we told them that we wouldn't be processing any such resignations till September. In the meantime, if they can pay something, they do. If they can't, they can't. But we're happy to talk to them again towards the end of September. So we were very open about accommodating whoever we could. And you're quite right, Greta, that our costs continued. But I have to say our members really appreciated the way we've reached out to them during these difficult times. We changed our pastoral services. We couldn't do visits. We not only rang the people we would normally visit, but we actually split up the 1,400 members between volunteers and staff and have been ringing them all just to say hello and check on how they're doing. So people appreciate it. They realise they're getting value. They also appreciate the fact that we were happy to hold off on receipt of payments.
Ian, do you want to add anything to that about how your communities are faring with the financial issue?
The conversations I've had with the leaders of the various communities is that most communities are doing it really tough. That most communities within the church, unlike our Jewish brothers and sisters, don't have contributions, and so it's much more a voluntary process. And whilst a percentage of our people will have, automatic debit and direct payments, etc., a significant number still rely on what happens in the plate or what happens at the door. And so most of our communities are struggling in that space. And we're looking at, one person said that they thought they'd be 50% down on their last year's. But I think we're all going to take a significant hit because of. It will depend a little bit on how soon we come back. It will depend on whether people have a sense of, as Ronnie said, recognising the gift of the community to the wider community, and they may continue to give even if their personal needs, if you like, aren't being met physically. But yeah, we'll wait and see. But I think 12 months hence we'll have a better read of, but I think most of us are preparing to have a negative going forward.
Now, Nadav, you have just a very quick comment, I hear?
Yeah. Ronnie's lucky. His synagogue trust deed and terms of membership provide for 12 months flexibility with becoming a non-financial member. But everyone else needs to check, particularly as elections come up, what your rules are for financial and non-financial members. You might, depending on the terms of your organisation, you might not be able to give people a fee waiver whilst they are still allowing them to be eligible to hold office.
Or
so you have to look at, or to vote. So you have to look at the terms of your constitution. It might be better to propose to amend your constitution before it's too late, before you have problems, before your board members and treasurer can't vote and so on and so forth. So you have to look at your rules and do it early rather than waiting 2 weeks too late when everyone becomes non-financial and you have a very big problem that results. Plan early, it's much easier.
Thank you.
Yep.
Greta, can we
Yes.
move on to the next question?
Yes, we can. So we've had a number of questions regarding faith-based rituals that cannot really be replaced by technology, such as the ritual mikvah baths in the Jewish community and the Eucharist in the Christian communities. And so the question is generally, how have we adapted to this? I suppose it's for Ian and Ronnie.
Yeah. Do you want to answer, Ian, about how you managed Eucharist?
Our world is really complicated. The church is basically divided into two different camps around our rituals. Some of our communities, the rituals have to be done in person. And in those communities, this has been a particularly distraught time for many people not to be able to physically gather to participate around baptisms, around Eucharist, around naming days, etc. Doesn't allow for the event to have its veracity. However, there is a proportion of the church for whom they have been really adaptable and been able to find new ways of being able to hold those events in isolation, but together. So, I know of one community, for instance, where 600 people gather every Sunday under Zoom, and they're still doing breaking of the bread because each person organises their own at home, and their understanding of the event is that they can do it in isolation but do it together because Zoom puts them in the same space. So we have a real diversity within the church. One of the greatest gifts was the gift that came at the beginning of June, where for our Eastern and Orthodox and our more traditional churches, they were allowed to have congregants of 10 people plus the people officiating, which allowed for 12 to 15, and the 10 congregants could actually participate in the liturgy of Eucharist. But we're in that diversity of both ends.
And Ronnie, very quickly, any specific thing that is dependent on congregants?
Yeah, I suppose the concept of a minyan, which was I mentioned before, was 10 males, in fact, aged 13 and over, is required for some parts of the service, but not for most parts of the service. One can say on their own, but there are some parts that require a minyan. And they need people face to face. Via Zoom doesn't cut it. Those parts simply were just not done. I know that there were people trying to find a minyan around the globe in order to say a particular prayer for someone who's passed away, and they were searching for someone. If I could pay someone to do it in West Africa, for example, then that would be great. But almost every synagogue around the globe closed, and so there are just some parts. But otherwise, for the majority of what we do, it can be done at home. It's not the same experience. It can be done.
Sheikh Saleem, just very quickly, anything specific in Islamic practice that requires an absolute gathering that couldn't be done or had to be varied?
Apparently, yes. For Friday congregations, usually it is large, but at least minimum has to be about 4. But then the community opted to have no Jummah prayer at all, because the problem is how to choose that 4, which one. Right. So we don't want to upset the community. So if we are going to hellfire, it's all of us together, so it is confused. I mean, community understood that everybody should be treated fairly. So even at the moment, 20 people can be praying together, but the mosque said no, we are not going to have it until.
Yes, can I ask on that issue of how do you tell who it should be, as we talk about resuming contact, are any of the faith communities, and also bearing in mind Nadav's caution about legal liability if people get sick as a consequence, is anyone imposing testing or, yes, So Ronnie's saying for re-entry for high holidays, you're going to ask people for a certificate, or?
For re-entry already, so already we're now allowed, we were allowed 10, we're now allowed 20 plus a couple of people to run the services. Already people have to register, they have to contact us. We give priority for those who've got a bar mitzvah or some other commemoration. They'll get a priority, but otherwise they have to contact us. We put them on a list and we email them in advance a series of questions for which they must truthfully be able to say no. So, have you got temperature? Have you been overseas the last 2 weeks? Have you got a cough or runny nose? Have you lost taste, sense of smell or taste? So there's a series of questions we send them. If they say no, then they're allowed to come. They're on our list of 22 people. When they turn up at the gate,
on a very quick yes/no basis, as the lawyer, is taking those kinds of precautions likely to be sufficient as reasonable measures to stave off any litigation if there was an outbreak?
No. Sorry to say, no. It's a good start, and it will get you some mitigation, but there's a lot more that you would have to do in order to do it. I would suggest that people enter an indemnification agreement in which they waive any claim against the synagogue for any illness that they may contract. And at the same time, if they breach those terms, that representation, that they acknowledge that they are liable to indemnify the synagogue for any loss that they have in turn. But I just add that at least from a Jewish perspective, coming into a synagogue if you are ill or may be ill is potentially akin to murder. So it carries a religious penalty which is possibly far more severe than merely having the lawyers come after you. The biggest thing that needs to happen is you need to ensure that there's no crowding. So if you want to do a simple thing, go outside your building with a roll of masking tape and draw lines on the ground every 2 meters and signs for people not to queue even to enter the building closer than that.
Already done.
Okay. Maybe we've got one last question from Greta.
Well, this could be a sum up question for everyone. Just
yes, well, maybe we would just do that. How has this COVID virus pandemic situation changed your understanding of your role and that of community? Just a quick whip around. Ian, starting with you. What does it leave you with?
Does it leave?
As a minister, as a person of community?
A couple of things. One is around the issue of accountability and modelling. And I think it changes the role and the model of who we are as leaders. We have to be modelling responsibility and appropriate behaviour. It also raises the notion of what does it mean to care in a new way. So it alters the definition of care for your people. So the things that Ronnie's talked about, the things that Nadav have picked up, the things that Tim's talked about, there's this new world where you've got to be thinking through, you know, how you space your people at the front, how you pre-book people. Yeah, I'm aware of one church that's gone to Eventbrite and sets up all its services on Eventbrite. It's got a cut-off point, the first number in, you got a ticket, you turn up, you've got your ticket, that's changing. I think that's altered my world. Yeah.
Ronnie, leadership of community, how has this experience changed that? Governance and religious leadership?
Be on the forefront. That's the first thing. People don't want to wait, because someone previously mentioned people will start making up stories along the way. Be on the front foot. We developed a pandemic policy, which our board approved, and if people are interested, we're happy to share it with people, which discussed how we cut down things, and along the way we've now added to it how we resume services in a staggered way. So be on the front foot. That's going to be very important, because otherwise people will make up stuff.
I'm glad you reminded me of that. We are putting together a set of resources from multi-faith communities, and Ronnie has kindly offered his. Adam has very kindly also offered to share with us some working documents that Ready1, the accounting firm, has prepared as a sort of a quick reference guide. We will ask our panellists and anyone else we can cajole into asking the questions that you sent by way of chat to Greta that couldn't be answered, because I promised a hard close, and we will post those on a mechanism to be decided, so that you don't have to go away with a burning question that we didn't answer. We hope that this event has been useful. We tried to add value. We've been working with faith-based communities for some time. It's been a fantastically informative and interesting session. I've certainly learnt a great deal. It has been a challenge for everybody. So I would particularly like to thank, and you know, you do the traditional hand clapping, all of our panellists, our experts, our two particular panellists, Sheik, Saleem in the last minute, and we will be writing to everyone who registered, and we'll be posting a recording of this for those that couldn't be here, along with some resources. If any of the audience have got resources that they'd like to share, please send them to us, and we can make that a communal knowledge information sharing platform. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Wonderful to have you with us. I'll ask the panellists to stay for a quick debrief, and goodbye to everyone. Thanks so much.